was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. My sister Emma and I had been saving up for months to treat ourselves to something special, our first ever Christmas cruise. We boarded in Miami, full of excitement, ready to explore the turquoise waters of the Caribbean and escape the chilly winter back home in Boston. The ship was everything we imagined and more. Luxurious dining rooms decked out with Christmas lights, live bands playing carols, and smiling families everywhere. It felt like stepping into a holiday movie. After dinner that first night, Emma and I decided to explore the ship. We wandered around, snapping pictures of the glittering decks and the endless ocean under the starlit sky. It was all so perfect, almost too perfect. As we walked along the quieter parts of the ship near the stern, I noticed how eerily silent it was compared to the lively celebrations inside. I joked to Emma about how this part of the ship felt like the set of a horror movie. She laughed it off, saying I was just trying to freak her out. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know that strange sensation when your gut tries to warn you? Yeah, that. I brushed it aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, what could possibly go wrong on such a magical trip? The next morning, Emma and I grabbed breakfast and headed to the pool deck. Families were lounging around, kids were splashing in the water. It was the picture of joy. But then, I saw her. A woman sitting alone at the far end of the deck, staring at the water like it held some kind of secret. She was odd. Her hair was messy, her clothes slightly disheveled, and her eyes, they were wild like she hadn't slept in days. Sitting next to her was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, pale as a ghost. He didn't speak or move much, just sat there clutching a small stuffed bear. Emma, always the curious one, nudged me. "Let's say hi," she whispered. I wasn't so sure. Something about the woman felt wrong. But before I could protest, Emma was already walking over. "Hi there, lovely day, isn't it?" Emma said, her usual cheerful self. The woman turned her head slowly, fixing Emma with a look that sent chills down my spine. She didn't smile. Instead, she muttered something under her breath, too quiet to make out. Then, out of nowhere, she looked directly at me and said, "Not everyone belongs here." Her voice was flat, almost mechanical. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was a warning. Emma tried to brush it off, laughing nervously, but I couldn't shake the unease. The boy didn't say a word. He just stared at us with those hollow eyes as the woman pulled him close and whispered something into his ear. We walked away quickly, Emma brushing it off as a random encounter with someone a little odd. But me? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far worse. The third night of the cruise was the kind of evening you dream about. The sky was clear, and the stars reflected off the calm water like a mirror. Emma and I had just finished another fantastic dinner, a Caribbean feast with grilled lobster and coconut rice. We decided to head out to the quieter part of the ship again, the stern, where we could enjoy some peace away from the crowds. Walking along the deck, I felt the same eerie sensation creeping up my spine as before. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound breaking the silence. Emma was busy fiddling with her phone, trying to get a picture of the full moon. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. Then, we heard it. A scream. Not the playful kind you hear from kids splashing in the pool. This was sharp, desperate, and bone-chilling. It came from somewhere near the railing at the back of the ship. Without thinking, Emma and I ran toward the noise. As we rounded the corner, my heart stopped. It was her, the woman we'd seen earlier. She was standing by the railing, holding her son in her arms. But she wasn't cradling him. She was holding him over the edge of the ship, her hands gripping him tightly under his arms. The boy was screaming, kicking his legs wildly. "No, Mommy, no, please don't." His cries echoed in the stillness of the night. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Emma, on the other hand, didn't hesitate. She shouted, "Hey, what are you doing? Stop!" Her voice was sharp, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to us, her face split into a wide, unnatural grin. "He's free now," she said, almost singing. "Free from all of it." Before we could get closer, she let go. The boy's scream was cut off as he plunged into the dark ocean below. Time seemed to freeze. I could barely hear Emma screaming over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I ran to the railing and looked down. The boy was thrashing in the water, his tiny arms flailing against the waves. "Help! Somebody help!" Emma yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. The woman just stood there, laughing hysterically. "Mommy loves you, sweetheart," she shouted, waving at the boy as if this was some kind of twisted game. Within seconds, the ship's emergency alarms blared and bright floodlights lit up the water. The crew sprang into action, shouting orders and throwing life rings overboard. One crew member, a young guy who couldn't have been older than 25, jumped into the water without hesitation. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles turned white, watching helplessly as the boy's head bobbed in and out of the water. The crew member swam toward him, fighting the current. It felt like an eternity, but finally he reached the boy and secured him in one of the life rings. Cheers erupted from the passengers who had gathered behind us. But the relief was short-lived. The boy wasn't moving much when they hauled him back onto the ship. He was alive but barely conscious, his small body trembling uncontrollably. The mother didn't resist when security arrived to detain her. She just stood there, grinning like she was proud of what she'd done. As they escorted her away, she muttered, "No more chains. He's free now. So am I." I stood there in shock, my mind racing. What did she mean by chains? What could drive someone to do something so horrifying? As the ship's crew worked to calm the passengers, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The boy was rushed to the ship's infirmary, carried by the crew member who had dived in to save him. Emma and I followed closely, not wanting to leave the boy alone with strangers. He looked so small, so fragile, wrapped in a thermal blanket, his lips blue and trembling. Inside the infirmary, the doctor worked quickly, checking his vitals and warming him up. Emma paced back and forth, biting her nails, while I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. How could someone do that to their own kid? Emma muttered under her breath, her voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. The memory of the woman's twisted smile was burned into my mind. She wasn't just unstable, she was dangerous. Not long after, one of the security officers stopped by to check on the boy. "He's stable," the doctor said, her voice calm but serious. "But he's traumatized. He'll need a lot of care once we dock." The officer nodded and turned to us. "We've detained the mother," he said, his tone grim. "She's being held until we reach St. Thomas. But there's something you should know." Emma and I exchanged a nervous glance. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, lowering his voice. "We found her room. It's unsettling." Curiosity got the better of us. With the officer's reluctant approval, Emma and I followed him to the woman's cabin. As soon as he opened the door, the smell hit me, a mix of mildew and something metallic. The room was a mess. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and the walls were covered in what looked like scribbles made with a marker. Upon closer inspection, the scribbles weren't random. They were phrases repeated over and over again. "Release the chains. Set them free. The water cleanses all." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words aloud. On the small desk by the bed, there were papers filled with similar writings, along with crudely drawn pictures of a woman and a child standing by the ocean. Then Emma gasped. "Look at this." She pointed to a photograph pinned to the wall. It was of the boy, smiling brightly in what looked like a happier time, but his face had been defaced with red ink, crossed out repeatedly. "This is sick," I said, my voice trembling. "She planned this, didn't she?" The officer nodded. "That's what it looks like. According to some passengers, she's been acting strange since the cruise began, talking to herself, avoiding groups. But no one thought she was capable of..." He trailed off, glancing at the defaced photo. As we left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. What drove her to do something so horrific? And why did she seem so convinced that throwing her child into the sea was some kind of salvation? After leaving the woman's room, I couldn't bring myself to return to the festivities on the upper decks. The once lively ship felt different now, heavy, quiet, as if the horror that unfolded had cast a shadow over everyone. Emma and I sat in a corner of the lounge, sipping on lukewarm coffee. Neither of us spoke for a while. I couldn't stop thinking about the boy. His hollow eyes, his weak cries for help. It all replayed in my head like a broken record. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Emma finally asked, breaking the silence. "I hope so," I said, though my voice betrayed my doubt. I wanted to believe he could recover, but how do you heal from something like that? As the night wore on, I wandered back to the stern of the ship, the same spot where it all happened. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, black and still as if it had swallowed the chaos and returned to its usual indifferent self. I leaned over the railing, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed something. A small stuffed bear floating in the water below, caught in the ship's wake. It was his, the boy's toy. My stomach turned as I realized how close he had come to being lost forever. For the first time in years, I prayed. I prayed for the boy, for his future, for some kind of light to break through the darkness that had consumed this trip. The next morning, the ship docked in St. Thomas. Passengers gathered on the decks, eager to disembark and put the nightmare behind them. Emma and I stayed back, watching as local authorities boarded to take custody of the woman. She was calm now, almost eerily so. As the officers led her away in handcuffs, she turned to the crowd and smiled. "He's free now," she said, her voice soft and almost tender. "And so am I." Her words lingered in the air, chilling and inexplicable. Part of me wanted to scream at her, demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She was trapped in her own world, far removed from the reality the rest of us lived in. We stayed on the ship until most of the passengers had disembarked. I wanted to check on the boy one last time. The crew allowed us a brief visit to the infirmary. He was awake, clutching a new stuffed animal someone had given him, but his eyes were distant. He didn't say much, only nodding when Emma told him he was brave. As we left the ship, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung over me. The woman's words, the scribbles on her walls, the boy's hollow stare. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. Even now, weeks later, I can't get that night out of my head. The sea, vast and silent, feels more ominous than ever. What scares me the most isn't the woman's actions. It's the thought that somewhere deep down she truly believed she was saving him. Landing a job as a bartender on the Carnival Mardi Gras was the moment my life finally aligned with my dreams. I'd worked my way up in New Orleans bars, pouring drinks for locals and tourists, hoping for a chance to see the world. When I got the call, I knew this was my big break, a transatlantic cruise from Miami to Southampton, England, with stops in Bermuda and Lisbon. 10 days of luxury, laughter, and a paycheck to match? Sign me up. The ship was enormous, practically a floating city. My first glimpse of it in Miami left me awestruck. Gleaming white decks stretched endlessly, and its towering structure seemed to scrape the sky. The moment I stepped on board, I was hit by the sheer energy. Passengers laughing, staff rushing, and music spilling out of every corner. It was intoxicating. The bar was my domain. I loved the rhythm of it, the clinking glasses, the hum of conversation, the quick exchanges with people from all walks of life. Every shift was a whirlwind, but I thrived in the chaos. On my third night, things slowed down just enough for me to notice him. He sat at the far end of the bar, alone, nursing an old-fashioned. There was something about him. Sharp features, dark hair, and an air of quiet confidence. He looked out of place, too polished, too composed. "Another one?" I asked as I collected his empty glass. He looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. "Please," You make it well." It was a simple compliment, but something about the way he said it stuck with me. He introduced himself as Nolan. Over the next few nights, he became a regular. Nolan's routine was almost unsettling. He always arrived within minutes of my shift starting, always ordered the same drink, and always sat in the same seat. He wasn't like most passengers. While others bragged about their careers or gossiped loudly, Nolan listened. He asked questions. Real questions. He wanted to know about me, why I chose this job, what my favorite city was, and what I dreamed of doing next. At first, it was flattering. He had a calm presence, and his voice carried this quiet authority that made you want to open up. But as the nights went on, I started to notice odd things. Nolan always seemed to know more about me than I'd shared. He mentioned the necklace I wore one night, a small locket my grandmother had given me, and asked if it had sentimental value. I hadn't told him about it. Then there was the way he lingered long after the bar started to clear out. One night, as I was cleaning up, he stood and said, "You have a unique energy, you know. It's refreshing." "Thanks," I said, trying to sound casual. But his words hung in the air long after he'd left. The next day, one of my coworkers, Jack, pulled me aside. "That guy Nolan," he said. "I swear I've seen him before, but I can't place where. You think he's famous or something?" I joked, trying to shake off the unease that was starting to creep in. But Jack's comment planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. The closer we got to Bermuda, the more unsettling Nolan became. His presence was no longer charming. It was suffocating. Every interaction felt calculated, like he was studying me. One night, I caught him watching me from across the bar, his gaze unblinking. Then he started to open up. He told me about his past, his failed engagement, and his betrayal by someone he thought he could trust. "I needed this trip," he said, his voice low and steady. "I needed to start over." It was a story that could have been heartbreaking, but something about the way he told it didn't sit right with me. There was no sadness in his voice, only bitterness. His calm exterior cracked, revealing something darker. That same night, as I was heading back to my cabin, I felt someone watching me. The hallways were eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the ship's engines. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. Still, the feeling stayed with me. The final night before docking in Southampton was supposed to be a celebration. Passengers filled the bars and restaurants, the air electric with anticipation. I should have been excited, but I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. Nolan arrived late, dressed in a sharp black suit. His smile was wider than usual, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's our last night," he said. "Let me buy you a drink, something special." I hesitated. Employees weren't supposed to drink with passengers, but his charm was hard to resist. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Nolan stepped behind the bar with surprising ease, mixing a drink with practiced movements. "To new beginnings," he said, handing me the glass. "To new beginnings," I echoed, taking a sip. The drink was smooth, but an odd bitterness lingered. Within minutes, I felt lightheaded. My vision blurred and my limbs felt heavy. The last thing I remembered was Nolan's face, his expression calm and unbothered as the world faded to black. When I woke up, my head throbbed and my wrists ached. I was in my cabin, tied to the bed frame with strips of fabric. My belongings were scattered across the floor. My phone, my jewelry, my locket, gone. Panic set in as I struggled to free myself. When I finally broke loose, I found a note on the pillow. "You were perfect. Until next time." Nolan was gone. Security and the authorities were called, but there was little they could do. His cabin was empty, and the name he'd used was fake. The surveillance footage showed him leaving the ship early that morning, blending effortlessly into the crowd. Back in the States, I tried to move on, but a week after returning home, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photo of me at the bar taken during the cruise, no return address. Then came another photo, and another. Pictures of me walking to work, sitting in my apartment, even sleeping. He was watching me. The last photo came with a note. "Do you miss me? I'll see you soon." I changed my locks, moved to a new city, even changed my name. But it didn't matter. Nolan had stolen more than my belongings. He had taken my peace of mind, my ability to feel safe. Sometimes, I think I see him. A face in a crowd, a shadow on the street. I tell myself it's just paranoia, but deep down I know the truth. Nolan isn't done, and he'll find me again. Until then, I live with the fear. The fear of the shadow passenger who turned my dream job into a nightmare I'll never escape. Christmas was always special in my family, but not in the traditional way. No big family dinners, no stockings hung by the fireplace. We didn't even stay home. Every year, like clockwork, we'd escape the cold and head for the sun. In 2019, our destination was the Caribbean, aboard the massive Serenity Voyager. It was a 5-day cruise, departing from Miami and returning on Christmas Eve. The ship was like a city on water. Giant shopping promenades, endless pools, and restaurants serving food from every corner of the world. The moment we stepped on board, the festive vibe was intoxicating. Decorations were everywhere, sparkling garlands, huge Christmas trees, even fake snow machines. My younger brother, Kevin, was thrilled. At 18, he still had the curiosity of a kid, and I, at 23, was the responsible older sibling who got dragged into every adventure. That night, after a big family dinner, Kevin convinced me to explore the quieter parts of the ship. "We'll find the best view for stargazing," he said. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but it beat being stuck in the cabin. We found ourselves near the ship's bow, where the noise of the festivities faded, leaving only the sound of waves crashing against the hull. That's when we saw her. A woman, maybe in her late 30s, standing by the railing. She was dressed in a pale sundress, her hair messy and windswept. She wasn't looking at the stars or the sea. She was staring straight down into the black water below. Kevin, ever the curious one, walked closer. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't answer right away. Her hands clutched the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, she turned to face us. Her eyes were wide and hollow, like she hadn't slept in days. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Kevin frowned. "Hear what?" She turned back to the water. "The ocean, it calls them, it wants them." I felt a chill run down my spine. Kevin gave me a look, half concerned, half confused. Maybe you should talk to someone, like a crew member or..." She cut him off with a laugh. Not a warm laugh, but a sharp grating sound that didn't match her soft appearance. "They'll be free soon," she murmured. "No more rules, no more pain." Something about the way she said it made my stomach knot. Kevin tried again. "Ma'am, are you..." "They're down there," she said suddenly, pointing over the edge. "Go on, look." Against every instinct telling me to turn around and leave, I stepped closer to the railing. Kevin followed reluctantly. At first, all I saw was darkness, the endless void of the ocean at night. Then something moved. "Kevin," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see that?" Two small figures, barely visible, were flailing in the water below. My breath caught in my throat. They were children. "Help!" Kevin screamed, his voice breaking through the silence. He grabbed my arm. "We have to tell someone. Now!" He took off running, leaving me alone with the woman. She didn't move, didn't even flinch at his outburst. Instead, she leaned over the railing and waved. "Bye, babies," she called out, her voice sing-song. "Mama loves you." My chest tightened, a mix of horror and disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I snapped. "Why aren't you doing anything?" She turned to me, her expression calm, almost serene. "Because they're free now," she said simply. "The ocean will take care of them." I wanted to yell, to grab her, to do something, but I felt frozen. My body refused to move, as if it couldn't process the situation fast enough. Below us, the children's movements were slowing. their little arms barely breaking the surface of the water. Minutes stretched into eternity before I heard the sound of footsteps. Kevin had returned with a group of crew members. They sprang into action, throwing life rings into the water and shouting instructions to the kids. One of them grabbed a radio and called for a lifeboat. Meanwhile, the woman stepped back, her hands raised as if surrendering to the crew. "They're with the ocean now," she said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "You can't take them back." The ship's alarms blared as the lifeboat was lowered into the water. Passengers were starting to gather, murmuring and pointing as the crew worked frantically. I stayed glued to the spot, my eyes locked on the lifeboat as it made its way toward the children. From above, I could see one of the kids floating face down. The other was barely moving, their head dipping beneath the waves every few seconds. My heart pounded, each second feeling like a lifetime. Finally, the lifeboat reached them. The crew pulled the first child out of the water, a little boy no older than 6. He wasn't moving. They laid him flat, performing CPR as the boat turned toward the second child. This one, a girl, looked slightly older. She was limp as they lifted her into the boat. I felt a sliver of hope when one of the crew members shouted, "We've got them." But as the lifeboat was raised back onto the deck, it became clear that the worst had happened. Both children were unresponsive. The woman didn't cry, didn't even react. She just stood there smiling faintly as if the sight of her lifeless children brought her peace. The ship docked in Port Everglades the next morning, where the police were waiting. The woman was arrested immediately, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She didn't resist, didn't say a word, just walked off the ship with the same unsettling calmness she'd had all night. The news spread quickly among the passengers. Whispers filled the hallways as people tried to piece together the story. I overheard bits and pieces, how she'd boarded alone with her kids, how she'd been seen wandering the ship at odd hours, how she'd acted distant and strange throughout the cruise. Kevin and I gave statements to the authorities recounting everything we'd seen and heard. The officers thanked us, but their faces were grim. It was clear they'd heard stories like this before, too many times. Later, I learned that the woman had a history of mental illness. She'd told investigators that she believed the ocean was a pure place, a sanctuary where her children could escape the pain of the world. As twisted as her reasoning was, it didn't make it any easier to accept. It's been years since that night, but the memories are as vivid as ever. I can still hear the woman's voice, her eerie laugh, the way she said, "They're free now." I can still see the kids in the water, their tiny hands reaching for help that came too late. Kevin and I don't talk about it much. He deals with it in his own way, mostly by avoiding anything to do with the ocean. I've had my fair share of sleepless nights, replaying the events over and over, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. I've come to realize that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a tired woman in a sundress, smiling as she lets go of everything she's supposed to hold dear. That's the scariest part, the way it hides in plain sight. I don't know if sharing this story will bring me any closure, but I hope it serves as a reminder. Pay attention to the people around you. Ask questions, and if something feels off, don't ignore it. You never know when you might be someone's last chance. I needed a break. Life in New York City was a pressure cooker. Long hours at work, the constant noise, and the endless grind. When Matt, my boyfriend, suggested we book a luxury cruise to the Caribbean, I didn't hesitate. It was exactly what I needed. Blue skies, endless ocean, and a chance to leave all my worries behind. The ship was massive, like a floating city. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, and every imaginable luxury. Matt and I checked into our suite, complete with a private balcony and champagne on ice. It felt like a dream. The first night on board, we attended a glamorous party in the main ballroom. Everyone was dressed to impress, the atmosphere buzzing with excitement. Matt, always the social butterfly, mingled effortlessly. But my attention drifted to a man standing alone near the back of the room. He didn't fit in. His clothes were crumpled, his hair messy, and his eyes darted around like he was looking for someone or something. For a moment, our eyes met, and a chill ran down my spine. He looked desperate. "See that guy over there?" I whispered to Matt. Matt glanced over. "Yeah, so? Probably just a loner. Don't let it ruin your night." I nodded, but the unease lingered. There was something about him I couldn't shake. The next morning, as I sipped coffee on our balcony, I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin next to ours was ajar. I could hear muffled voices, a man and a woman arguing. Peering out discreetly, I saw him. The same man from the party. He was standing in the doorway, his face tense, while a blonde woman yelled at him. I couldn't make out the words, but their argument was heated. "Matt," I called softly, motioning him over. "That's the guy from last night." "So?" Matt replied, brushing it off. "Couples fight. Let them sort it out." But something about the way the man stood there, his shoulders hunched and his fists clenched, made me uneasy. It wasn't just an argument. It felt like a warning. That night, strange noises came from their cabin. Rhythmic thuds, like something heavy being dragged. I froze in bed, holding my breath as the sounds grew louder. Matt stirred beside me, groggy. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Probably moving furniture," he mumbled, rolling over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Our last night on the ship brought a storm. Rain pounded against the windows and the ship rocked with the waves. Matt and I decided to stay in, skipping the final party. As the wind howled outside, I tried to relax, telling myself I was overreacting about the man next door. Sometime after midnight, a loud knock at our door shattered the quiet. I bolted upright, heart racing. Matt groaned. "Who the hell knocks at this hour?" I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. My stomach dropped. It was him, the man from the party in the cabin next door. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, and streaks of what looked like blood smeared his cheeks. His eyes were wide and frantic. "Who is it?" Matt asked. "It's that guy," I whispered. "He looks, I don't know, crazy." The knocking turned into pounding. "Please," the man begged, his voice hoarse. "Open the door. You have to let me in. I need to show you something." "No way," Matt hissed, pulling me back from the door. "We're not opening it." The pounding grew more violent. The man's voice rose to a frantic shout. "You don't understand, it's not safe. Open the door before it's too late." I could feel my heart racing. "We should call security," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Matt grabbed his phone, dialing as the man outside started banging on the door with something metal. The sound of scraping filled the room, sending chills down my spine. "Security? We need help," Matt said into the phone. "Our cabin. There's a man trying to break in." The man's voice turned desperate, almost incoherent. "She made me do it. I didn't have a choice. I have to fix it before..." His words were cut off by a guttural scream, and then silence. Matt and I froze, staring at the door. Moments later, we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Security arrived, their radios crackling. When they opened the door, the man was gone, but a bloodied handprint smeared across the wood told us we hadn't imagined it. Security escorted us to another room for safety while they investigated. I couldn't stop shaking. Every knock, every shadow outside the window made me jump. Matt tried to comfort me, but he was just as rattled. About an hour later, one of the guards came in. His face was pale and his voice was tense. "We need to ask you a few questions," he said. "About the man you saw." I told them everything. The party, the argument, the sounds from the cabin next door, and his terrifying behavior outside our door. As I spoke, the guard's expression darkened. "Is he dangerous?" I asked hesitantly. The guard hesitated. "We found his wife in their cabin," he said. "She's gone. It looks like she fought back, but he stabbed her over 40 times with an ice pick." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Oh my God." "We're still searching for him," the guard added, "but we'll make sure you're safe." The next hours were a blur. The ship's corridors, once bustling with laughter and life, now felt eerie and deserted. Security swept through the decks, their radios buzzing with updates, but the ice pick man seemed to have vanished into thin air. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there watching. Every creak of the ship felt like a warning. Matt tried to distract me, but his nervous glances at the door gave away his fear. By dawn, the ship docked in Miami, but the man was still missing. Security suspected he'd jumped overboard during the night, but I wasn't convinced. Something about him didn't feel like the kind of person who'd give up. Matt and I left the ship as soon as we could, our bags hastily packed. The bustling port was a stark contrast to the fear we'd felt the night before, but the relief of being back on solid ground was short-lived. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The sound of his pounding on the door, his desperate screams, and the bloody handprint haunted my dreams. Every knock at my apartment door made me jump, half expecting to see his wild eyes staring back at me. Matt and I tried to move on, but the cracks were too deep. He buried himself in work, and I withdrew, consumed by the trauma. Eventually we broke up, both knowing we couldn't fix what had been shattered. I haven't set foot on a cruise ship since. People talk about cruises as an escape from reality, a safe haven in the middle of the ocean. But I know better. Evil doesn't care where you are, how much you've paid, or how safe you think you are. It can find you anywhere. And sometimes it knocks. You know, I never thought I was the kind of person who got lucky. My life was all about routine. Wake up, work, pay bills, repeat. So, when my boss announced I had won the company raffle, a first-class cruise to the Bahamas, I almost laughed. Me? Winning something? It felt too good to be true until I was holding those glossy tickets in my hands. It wasn't just any cruise. It was first class, all expenses paid. My boyfriend, Sam, was over the moon. "We're finally getting a taste of the good life," he said, grinning like a kid. Honestly, I couldn't wait either. We deserved this, a break from our mundane lives. The day we boarded the Royal Horizon in Miami, I was overwhelmed. The ship was enormous, like a floating city. Everything sparkled, the glass elevators, the chandeliers, even the staff uniforms. Our cabin was straight out of a travel magazine, complete with a balcony overlooking the endless ocean. Every moment felt like a dream. Gourmet dinners, live shows, and late-night dancing in exclusive lounges made us feel like royalty. For the first time in forever, I felt free. But then, on the second night, I noticed a man at breakfast with his wife. He wasn't doing anything strange, but something about him made me uneasy. His eyes darted around, his hands fidgeted, and he barely touched his food. His wife seemed calm, even cheerful, like she hadn't noticed. Sam dismissed my unease. "Maybe he's just not a morning person," he said, laughing. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't help glancing at him whenever we crossed paths. Something about him didn't sit right. By the third day, I'd almost convinced myself I was imagining things. The cruise was just too perfect to waste worrying about a stranger. That evening, after another amazing dinner, Sam and I walked back to our cabin. The hallway was quiet, dimly lit, with only the faint hum of the ship's engine breaking the silence. As we turned the corner, I saw him again. He was standing a few feet from our door, pacing back and forth. My chest tightened. "That's the guy," I whispered to Sam, tugging his arm. The man's head jerked up and our eyes met. His expression was hollow, his face pale. He looked at me for a moment, then turned and walked away without a word. "Weird," Sam said. "Maybe he's lost?" I nodded, but the encounter left me uneasy. Something was off about him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the last time we'd see him. Later that night, as Sam brushed his teeth in the bathroom, I was lying in bed, scrolling through Instagram. The soft rocking of the ship was soothing, and for a moment I felt relaxed. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. I froze. "Sam, did you order room service?" "Nope," he called back, his voice muffled. Why? My heart pounded as I approached the door. Something told me not to open it. Instead, I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. It was him, the man from the hallway. He stood there, his chest rising and falling like he'd been running. His eyes were wild, and in his hand he held something sharp and metallic. I stumbled back from the door, my mind racing. "Sam," I hissed. "Get out here now." Sam stepped out of the bathroom, toothbrush still in hand. "What is it?" "Look," I whispered, pointing at the door. He leaned in, peering through the peephole. His face hardened immediately. "What the hell?" he muttered. "Who is this guy?" Before I could answer, the man started knocking again, harder this time. "Let me in," he said, his voice low and strained. "You need to see this, please let me in." Sam grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the door. "We're calling security," he said, picking up the cabin phone. I could barely breathe as I heard him explain the situation to the operator. Meanwhile, the man outside grew more frantic. He slammed his fists against the door, shouting incoherently. "They're lying to you," he screamed. "You don't understand. They're hiding something." The metal object in his hand, an ice pick, scraped against the wood, leaving deep gouges. I pressed myself against Sam, shaking. It felt like an eternity before we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. "Security, step away from the door," a voice boomed. Through the peephole, I saw two officers approach the man. He turned to face them, his expression wild. "You don't get it," he shouted, pointing at our door with the ice pick. They know everything." "Sir, put down the weapon," one officer said, his tone calm but firm. For a moment it seemed like the man would comply. His shoulders sagged, and he lowered the ice pick slightly. But then he snapped, lunging at the door and slamming the ice pick into it. The officers tackled him to the ground. He thrashed and screamed, his voice echoing through the hallway. "You can't stop it," he howled. "They're lying to all of you." It wasn't until he was handcuffed and dragged away that I finally exhaled. My legs gave out and I sank to the floor. Sam knelt beside me, his arm around my shoulders. "It's over," he said, but I wasn't so sure. Security returned to our room about an hour later. The officers were grim-faced as they asked us to recount what had happened. I explained everything, from the breakfast encounter to the moment he attacked our door. One of the officers nodded solemnly. "We've detained him," he said, "but there's something you should know." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" "The man's wife was found dead in their cabin," he said. "It looks like she was attacked with..." He paused, glancing at the splintered door. "An ice pick." My stomach churned. Sam tightened his grip on my hand, but it didn't help. The officer continued. "We believe he had a psychotic break. He claimed his wife was part of some conspiracy against him. We're investigating further, but for now we're moving you to another cabin for your safety." The rest of the trip was a blur. We were escorted to a different deck, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow outside the window made my heart race. The ship docked early in Miami, and police were waiting to take the man into custody. As we walked off the ship, I caught a glimpse of him being led away in handcuffs. His head was down, but as we passed, he looked up. Our eyes met, and a chill ran down my spine. There was something in his expression. Regret? Madness? I'll never know. It's been years, but that trip changed me. I still hear his voice in my nightmares, still feel the weight of his stare. I've tried to move on, but some scars don't heal. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to trust my instincts. That little voice that told me not to open the door, it saved my life. So, if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, do me a favor. Listen to it. And whatever you do, don't open the door. I never thought I'd be the type to go on a cruise. My family, though, had been obsessed with the idea for years, and after months of planning, it finally happened. A 7-day cruise from Miami to the Bahamas. To them, it was paradise. To me, at 18, it was more like being stuck in a floating hotel with zero escape from my loud, chaotic relatives. Still, I decided to give it a chance. The day we boarded was a whirlwind. Crowds, chaos, and way too much sunscreen smell. But stepping onto the ship, that was something else entirely. The Atlantic breeze was enormous, with shimmering glass elevators, pools that stretched like mirrors, and endless halls that smelled faintly of salt and luxury. For the first time, I felt a little spark of excitement. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. But then something strange happened. While we waited to board, I noticed a man standing alone near the terminal entrance. He wasn't like the other passengers buzzing with excitement. He was still, too still, with his hands shoved into the pockets of a dark hoodie that didn't fit the tropical heat. His eyes, they were locked on me. When our gazes met, he smiled. Not a warm smile, but a slow, deliberate smirk. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a random guy zoning out. But even as we stepped onto the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first 2 days of the cruise were a blur of food, pools, and endless family chatter. My little cousins ran wild. My parents indulged in margaritas, and I found my escape in quiet corners of the ship. But no matter where I went, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that someone was watching me. I saw him again by the pool on the second day. He was sitting alone, his hoodie still zipped up despite the blazing sun. He didn't look at me directly this time, but I knew he saw me. His presence was like a shadow, unnoticeable to anyone else but impossible for me to ignore. That night I caught sight of him in the dining hall. He wasn't eating, just sitting at a corner table, nursing a glass of water. When our eyes met, he tilted his head slightly as if acknowledging some unspoken connection between us. My heart raced, but I forced myself to look away. He hadn't done anything wrong, technically. I couldn't exactly accuse him of, what? Existing? By the third day, it was more than a feeling. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see him. And more often than not, I did. In the gift shop, on the observation deck, even near my cabin. He was always there, never close enough to confront, but never far enough to forget. When we docked in the Bahamas, I practically ran off the ship, desperate for a break from its suffocating halls and the man who haunted them. My family and I explored the island, its streets alive with music and the smell of fried plantains. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But that sense of relief didn't last. As we wandered through the bustling market, I spotted him again. He wasn't even trying to blend in this time. He stood a few stalls away, his hoodie unzipped to reveal a faded t-shirt, his eyes fixed on me like I was the only person in the world. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. How was this possible? How could he be everywhere? Before I could move, he was walking toward me. My parents were distracted, haggling over souvenirs, leaving me completely alone. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, almost friendly. "Enjoying the island?" I nodded, too scared to speak. "That's a nice necklace," he added, his eyes drifting to the gold chain around my neck. My grandmother's necklace, the only thing I had left of her. "Thanks," I said, stepping back. But he stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "You know, it's dangerous to wander off alone," he said, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, my dad called out, snapping me out of my trance. I turned to see my family waving me over, and when I looked back, the man was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the cabin felt like him, lurking, waiting. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. The hallways were eerily silent, the usual hum of the ship's nightlife replaced by an unsettling stillness. I ended up at the bow, drawn to the quiet expanse of the ocean. The moonlight danced on the water, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. Then I heard footsteps. I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone light, almost teasing. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He smiled, stepping closer. "That necklace, it doesn't belong to you." I took a step back, feeling the cold metal of the railing press against my back. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't. He lunged, grabbing my arm and yanking me toward him. His grip was like iron, and for a moment I thought, this is it. This is how it ends. I screamed, the sound tearing through the night as he tried to wrestle the necklace from my neck. I fought back with everything I had, kicking, scratching, anything to get away. But he was stronger, and with each second he pushed me closer to the edge. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he growled, his voice low and filled with menace. "Help!" I screamed, praying someone would hear me. "Please help!" He laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and shoved me harder against the railing. I could feel the ocean spray on my face, the cold wind whipping around us. My fingers clung to the railing, desperate for any shred of stability. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps. 2 crew members appeared, sprinting toward us. The man froze, his grip on me loosening just enough for me to break free. I stumbled back, gasping for air, as the crew tackled him to the ground. One of them helped me to my feet, their voice a blur of questions and reassurances. I couldn't answer. I couldn't do anything but watch as they restrained him, his smirk replaced by a venomous glare. "This isn't over," he hissed as they dragged him away. By the time we docked in Miami, I was emotionally drained. The man was taken off the ship in handcuffs, surrounded by police. I watched from a distance, my hands trembling as I clutched the repaired necklace. The police later told us he was a wanted criminal, responsible for multiple assaults and even a few murders. My blood ran cold. If those crew members hadn't shown up, I would have been another name on his list. The cruise line offered us a full refund and an upgrade to first-class suites for our next trip. My parents accepted, but I knew I'd never set foot on a cruise ship again. The ocean, once a source of wonder, now felt like a dark, endless void. Therapy helped me process the trauma. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that gut feeling that told me something wasn't right. And while I still have nightmares, I'm grateful to be alive. As for the necklace, it feels heavier now, like it carries the weight of that night. But I wear it anyway. It's a reminder of my grandmother, of her strength and mine, because in the end, I survived. And that's what matters most.